All right, so welcome. Today we're doing assessments using Little Apps from StatPREP. My name is Ambika Silva. I'm on the leadership team from on StatPREP. I see we have a couple participants. We're going to hold questions till the end for speaking, but if you would like to start the chat, if you have any things you want to add in, please feel free to do so during. And we also have Grace, who's from the MAA with us, and she can help us with any technical issues, and she'll also be fielding some questions. So I wanted to, before we get started, remind everyone of the MAA recording policy. This is being recorded, and we do retain the right to show it and distribute it. So we want to make sure that you are okay with that. So if you say your name or chat or anything, then we want to make sure that you are being monitored. So let's talk about assessment. It's one of the most important things that we do in teaching. And assessment in education is the process of gathering, interpreting, recording, and using information about our student responses to an educational task. So some guiding questions for determining the proper assessments. What kind of essential or enduring skills, what am I trying to assess from either skills or the content? How does the assessment allow students to demonstrate said skills or demonstrate mastery? Is this assessment more of a test of a process or content? And is that what you're really after? So with effective assessment, it's really great to identify learning goals. What are you trying to get out of it? As you're trying to do things, of course, it's great to have checks for understanding along the way. So kind of like an informal assessment where we kind of see, are they getting what I'm giving, and are they understanding what I'm doing? So when we say assessment, there's formal assessment, there's informal assessment, and checks for understanding is definitely an informal assessment. Identifying student interests and identifying students' preferred way of learning. This is a really good thing to kind of see, do they prefer active learning? Do they prefer hands-on? Do they prefer having a handout and working on things? I think it's really important for us to gauge our classes and to understand like what generational changes might be happening. Right now we have our Gen Z students coming in and they may be learning differently than our previous ones and then the millennials. And assess often. It doesn't have to be a midterm and final. It doesn't even have to be a few tests in a final. Make sure you're assessing along the way. So it's really good to kind of take temperature checks along the way as we do things. So I thought this was kind of a cool quote because I'm relating it to data. So data helps us understand where we are right now. It also helps us where we want to go and what we want to do, but it helps us understand where we are right now. And I thought that was kind of fitting considering that we're going to be working with some data. So there's summative assessments and formative assessments. Summative is where you're capturing one moment in time. This is where we usually refer to like unit tests, the final, things like that. And it's a way to kind of capture one moment of saying, this is where they are. It's a snapshot. Formative assessments are assessments that we really want to increase student learning. There's ways for them to progress towards that target, and this could be done through feedback, the checks for understanding, or low stakes assessments. So for formative assessments, since that's kind of like what we more often do, is where we have these kind of learning goals that we want them to get. Think about what kind of conversations we can have between us and our students to have them really think about the data, think about what we're trying to ask them, and then be able to give them feedback to enhance their learning, to enhance their understanding. And that active involvement between teacher and student is what really helps them progress a lot deeper. So I'm going to focus on the Center and Spread Little app. We're going to post some questions based on the variables that we have to play with and see what kind of responses we can do with data, what responses are with data, and then have a discussion on them. So I posted the link here, but I'm going to get out of the PowerPoint and go to the StatPREP website. So this is statprep.org. And to get to the Little Apps, you're going to go over here to Resources and then click on the Little Apps right here. And you can scroll down and it has all sorts of little apps, and it kind of gives you a brief little description of each one. I'm going to focus on center and spread. So I'm going to go to this one. So I can see here, here's ages. If I want to split up by gender, let's say, so I have male and female, and then I can see the age. There doesn't seem to be much difference on there. When you're showing your students this, it's always good to kind of have them do it along with you and remind them that their graph may not look exactly like what they're seeing on the screen. And then have them kind of play around with it and say, well, here's the mean. And maybe talk about what that means. Who's older, what's a typical age for females versus a typical age for males in our sample, that sort of thing. Now in here, let's say I want to go back to this and say, do I think there's a significant difference in ages based on marital status? Maybe you pose that to your class, and maybe you've kind of showed them a couple things on the StatPREP Little App, and you've posed a question for them, and you want them to do it, to answer that question, and answer it with data. So once you've gotten on here, I would probably give my class a little bit of time to kind of play with it. But since we're not going to do that, I'm going to kind of zip ahead. And so let's say I go to, I wanted age, but I wanted it to be marital status. And so now I'm seeing divorced, live with partner, married, never married, and widowed. Now, after students have had some time to kind of look this over, maybe you can have them explain. Most often students are going to say, oh, they can see that widowed is much higher than the other ones, and they can see why that's probably the case, that the typical age of a widow is probably a lot older than the other groups. And then what's something that could be kind of interesting here is that you notice that there's only 2 dots here for the widowed. There's a lot of dots in the married. And less dots everywhere else. And I can see my sample size is 50. If I want to increase that, let's say I increase it to like 100, thinking I'm going to get more. All right, I went from 2 to 3 for the widowed, lots more in here, and none in the separated. So this is kind of interesting here. I'm taking a random sample of 100, and I'm getting that out here. What I can do is click on Stratify and ask my students, what does this mean? What did that do if I clicked on Stratify? Well, it gave me a lot more dots in all of these. So it looks like I'm getting 100 dots, not just across the board, but 100 dots in each one. So that if I'm taking a sample and I really want to see 100 widows that I can compare, when there was only 2 or 3, maybe that wasn't really significant for me to say, yeah, it's an older age versus the rest of it. But now I can see that there's quite a lot of data there, and we can do that as well. Maybe I want to hit on the median. This might be a good time to also talk about the jitter plots. So it's kind of like almost like a dot plot, but it's more just kind of, it's instead of just straight. So you can see here, you have 3 that are about at 63, but instead of piling it vertically to see like a dot plot that we normally see, we would see it just kind of spread out. And you can make it wider or narrower if you go to the jitter plot applet. So you can play with that little app to work on that as well. And down here, you can see that it shows a jittered plot. So it might be good to kind of explain that to your students, or maybe not, and see what do they think about it. Another thing that I think is kind of interesting is to talk about shape in here, and what kind of shape do you think that these graphs would be? So maybe we have something up here, we've gone through the class, and everyone has a size of 100. They're not going to be exactly the same, but chances are they're somewhat similar in terms of like, this is much higher, this is lower, and and that sort of thing. So you can kind of just have a class discussion or have them share with a partner about that. Now, if I'm looking, it looks like the mean and median, when I clicked off the median, so the blue one is the median, and these two for separated and divorced, the mean and median are about the same. What do you think that means about our graph and our shape of our graph? And with these are a little bit for live with a partner, and for married, seem like those are a little bit, and for widowed as well, seems like it's a little bit different. So when I click them off and on, it might be good to kind of have them kind of think to themselves, how does shape relate to where the mean and median are? Can I tell what the graph looks like if I were to do it? And so these kind of discussions of, and does that make sense for the data? So when I say live with a partner, it looks like it's not bell curved. I have a bunch of data down here between 20 and 30, and then it kind of drifts off this way. I only have one at like 75. So it looks like it's probably going to be a right skewed graph, which makes sense. A lot of people are going to live with their partner, and then maybe get married or whatnot. So less are going to be living together as a partner rather than being married later on. So it kind of makes sense to say that this is a right skewed. What about the widowed? If I click it on and off and I see that the median is higher for the widowed, and when I think about what shape it should be, how can I explain this? So I would, again, every time we're doing this with our class, have them pause, talk to each other, have them explain it out loud. It's really great for them to explain to each other, so it's a little bit less intimidating, and then have them go to the graph and talk out loud in front of the class and see if they can explain things. And then afterwards, I always like to come around and say, okay, let's talk about it and go a little bit deeper in it. And then we can talk about, well, then widowed would be less skewed because there's a lot of more older in that category versus some that are a little bit younger. And then we can talk about the relationship between mean and median. When is the mean bigger than the median? When is the median bigger or smaller? So those are the kind of discussions we can definitely have from this screenshot alone. You can have your students kind of play around with stuff, find other variables to kind of see and have them explain something else. Other kind of cool stuff in here, if you do like a density, it's almost like if I cut it in half, I can kind of see that I kind of get that right skewed shape. It kind of gives that shape as more of a outer rather than what we're used to seeing as like a bell plot and that sort of thing. So you can see like here, this looks a little bit more bell curved because it's a little more populated right here and less on the sides. But so just another way to kind of look at graphs, which is kind of interesting. Now, if you do not have technology in your class, then I say always be prepared. So I'm going to go back to here. Do it with them, go over jittering, what is the sample size of 50, stratified, let them explore. So we kind of did that together, but I always say be prepared. If you have technical issues during class, or you don't have technology in your classroom, you want to show something specific, like something like the data doesn't always do what we would think it would, but you know, if you want to show something specific, you definitely can kind of freeze something and say, I want to show this. Or I want my students to write something down, have some images just in case. And so I had something done just in case I was having issues getting on the website or the lab or whatnot. And you can see that I had something like this, and maybe I would just have my students explain this. So no technology on their part needed. They can just kind of talk about this, and we can have those same conversations that we did going on to the little app that we did just now with just this screenshot here. So as a closure, if we talk about things, what can we do? We kind of discuss this, what kind of shapes, what can we tell about using the mean or the median? What does typical mean? What does typical range mean? And emphasize on explaining. So they might be able to say here that the average, this is higher than this, right? They're gonna be able to say that. What does that mean? That the typical separated person or person who's separated as their marital status is older than a typical person who's never been married. So I want always for them to be able to explain. It doesn't have to be perfect with statistical vocabulary, but I definitely want them to be able to, I always say, explain it to me the way you would someone who is outside of this class, never taken a stats class. So this type of assessment is this formative assessment allows students to learn to communicate how they are reading graphs, not only to me, but to each other. It's low stakes, so there's no pressure. It's not like an exam, but it helps them what's going to be on the exam or what's going to be on my exam. The summative assessment is the assessment of learning. So not just the pathway of me trying to get them to learn what I want them to learn, but that assessment of did they really get it at the end. And it's usually a test or a final, that sort of thing. So this is more of a formal assessment. So maybe if going back to this, not letting them play. So on formal assessments, I don't let them play with the little apps or technology, but I could give them a screenshot because they've played with it before in class. We've talked about it together. It's different variables, but it's still same kind of ideas that I want them to be able to understand. So looking at this, I have above is the income of the household for various educational levels. Answer the following question. Which educational level typically makes the highest income? How can you tell? And so in my class where we talked about it, we talked about what typical means, we talked about what typical range means, so maybe like 1 standard deviation away, or from Q1 to Q3 if we're doing a box plot, but we can give some sort of range. If I say typical, then I want them to say where the mean or the median is, and really I'd like them to use the mean or the median based on what kind of shape it is. So the highest, it looks like they'd probably say one of these, the college grad, because both the mean and the median are higher than the rest of the categories. So I would say, how can you tell? Because the median is at looks like maybe like 85,000 and the mean is like at 75,000. So I would want that kind of responses. Which education level is the most skewed? Which way is it skewed and how can you tell? So it's kind of a tricky question the way that I wrote it, because I would have gone over, well, how far apart the mean and median are, and then kind of looking at the graph itself, and it looks like, well, these two are definitely out, right? Those are pretty close to each other. They're going off to the sides. So I'd say this is probably either symmetric or bell curves. I'm looking at those, but I'm looking at these and seeing how far apart the mean and median is, and same thing for college grad. So if my student had said 9th to 11th grade, so if they had an education of 9th to 11th grade, because the mean and median are very far apart, that would be great for that first one, because these are so close to each other, 9th to 11th grade and the college grad. Which way is it skewed? That's where I'm going to be able to tell if they understood that discussion we've had before, is that they could say that the median is smaller than the mean, so it must be skewed right. They could be talking about the cluster of dots that are on the lower end, and there's a few dots that are a little bit higher than the rest, or much higher than the rest. So they can kind of tell me not only in one way, but a couple of different ways, and I'll take that. And likewise, because these are so close, if they had done the same thing for college grad, then I would have taken that as well. Or if they kind of even better, if they said, well, 9th and 11th grade and college grad kind of look both very skewed, and one's way skewed and one's way skewed. So for number 3, what is the shape of the data for those who had an 8th grade education as their highest level? And again, we kind of talked about this. I'd want them to see about the cluster of dots and which way it goes, but it's all about how they explain, right? They want to be able to articulate what they're saying. A lot of times students say, oh yeah, no, I can see that that's right skewed, or they've memorized that if the mean is bigger than the median, that it's going to be right skewed. And that's not what I want them to do. I want them to really be able to explain why they're saying that it's skewed. So those are a couple things that I just wanted to kind of go over. We didn't go over a lot of the different little apps. That kind of way of thinking from that summative to formative to summative assessment is what I really wanted to post on. I'm going to have Grace unlock everyone for if you have any questions or thoughts or ideas. I'd love to hear. And then anything on MA Connect, if you want to post on things that you're doing similar to, or how you assess, would love to hear that as well. So I'll open it up for questions.
All right, folks, so I've got everyone but Jennifer unmuted. Jennifer, Zoom's coming up with an error saying that you're using an older version of Zoom. So if you have any questions, please feel free to just use the chat function and we'll get to you.
So Jennifer says she couldn't get the download to work, but at least you're still here, Jennifer. So that's good that you were able to still come in and do it. Oops. Okay, so hearing no questions, then I will stop this webinar in just a moment. But again, if you have any questions, thoughts, you can email me, post on MAA Connect, talk to each other. I'd love to hear what everyone's doing.
And before you go, I just want to draw your attention. Jennifer's still putting a couple things in the chat window.
Okay, so then let's look at that. I love the questions that you ask your students. I'm inspired to use this app next term. I also like that you base your tests on the activity. I think that's super important, Jennifer, for us to, if you do something in class, if I do an activity, if I use an app, it's so great for them to see that on the test because they're familiar with it. And it kind of gives it, they kind of know that if I'm going to be doing something in class, then hopefully it's going to be on the test, right? It gives them a little bit, it's low stakes at the time, but they know maybe I should be paying attention and really try to understand this. Yeah, thank you. I totally agree. So she loves that connection. I do as well. I think it's worked out really well, and it's so easy, and we're able to take those snipping tools. So if you are on a PC, it's snipping tools changed my life in terms of picking up stuff off of these kind of things like apps and such. So it's a great way to pose like really thoughtful questions.
Ambika, this is Rona. I wanted to ask, if you're teaching in a classroom that does have technology, do you allow them to have access to the little apps while they're taking an exam?
I don't. Hi, Rona.
Hi.
I don't because if I'm asking a question, it's a little hard to what's the word? Like if I said, go do this and then tell me about this, it's a little hard for me to see what was on their screen when they did it. Okay. You know, because data can be variable, that might be a little difficult for me. I would use it more for like a project or something where it wasn't like a test, but it was something like they can work on where they can grab pictures. And I would say, I've had my students go get a snipping and show me what you're looking at and then explain it. Okay. So if you can do your exams that way, then I'd say that's great. I'm not brave enough to do that yet, but
I was just curious. Yep.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great idea to do something because it really shows they're working on it, but I would definitely do it.
Okay.
Let's see what Jennifer. Thank you. You're welcome, Jennifer. Thank you for coming. Any other questions, comments, things that you've done? Okay, great. Well, again, thanks everyone for coming. And if you're watching this on the video on the after when it got recorded, then thank you for coming in. My name's Ambika Silva. You're welcome to email me with questions. You can go to MAA Connect and have a whole bunch of people that you can try to connect with so that we can talk. And of course, visit the StatPREP website at statprep.org to find all these little apps and other useful, helpful resources for our classes. And thank you to MAA for setting this up and getting this all together.